Guardado. 1, the guarded. 2, put away. The rounded monosyllabic sounds a ritual chant. Guardado, guardado. A barrier builds in the rolling R, harsh against an English tongue. In El Salvador, my name lifts out of the mouths of herders, moves across the land. My name a destination, Los Guardados, a place of ancestors and colonization. This name, branded on my family, rises out of the ashes in the wind. I can trace each syllable back to our canton, Buena Vista. It runs thick in my lineage. It is my mother's maiden name. I am Guardado, Guardado, a name that hides history from itself.
Goodness gracious, that's such an awesome poem and such an awesome way to start the text. Thank you so much for being here, Cynthia. Really
Thank you.
Means a lot. So much attention is paid to the speaker's name in this text. And I feel as though a great way to start is to ask the proverbial, what's in a name?
The word guardado, you can use it in like a colloquial sentence, just saying like, oh, I put it away there, right? Or you can say like, oh, I've been guarding that, right? So those are the two ways that you can actually use this word, right? And it happens to be our last name. Where we're from, there's this town called Los Guardados, and it's very close to our canton. So a canton is like a village. Currently, the population where we're from is still only like 300 people, and they're all like small little villages that are around each other. So part of tracing it is sort of like, I know this is a Spanish name, right? That this comes from colonialism. And in my family too, like with my grandparents and great grandparents, there was always like a lighter skin, fair skinned, even colored eyes, blonde hair, and then like an indigenous grandparent, like coupling. So then there, like, I know that I have that colonial blood, right? Obviously, I mean, also did ancestry. So yes, 39% of it.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. So, you know, I know that it's there. And so part of that is like tracing that name. And I'm actually Guardado, because my grandmother, my father's mother, did not give my father his dad's name. So she actually, my last name could have been like Guardado Ayala. Ayala would have been my last name, but my grandmother gave my dad her last name. And so that was also my mom's last name. So then I'm Guardado double.
I'm so impressed by the way that this speaker has come to terms with their relationship with their father, but then also gives this great empathy and respect and just love that I long for. So much of my work is searching for my father, and I envy that while reading this text. I was wondering if you could read my father's testimony at St. Vincent de Paul, 1999.
At 14, I sit alone in a back pew near the exit, while my father takes his turn at the altar. I remove my headphones when his voice begins to fill the golden dome of the church. He tells a story about when I was 9, the one in which he sent me to the toilet, punished for having wet myself. His voice echoes in the dome when he says how he hit me across the mouth. I remember my nose bled into my hands, and my older sister watched in fear. My father skips ahead to when he left for his usual graveyard shift, and here he remaps our history with a part of the story I had only learned to long for. He admits he cried when he was alone, felt guilty for his inability to show his daughters he was not a monster. I cry quietly as my father shares with a room full of strangers what he could never tell me. He confesses how he wishes in his youth he'd been tender like his words are now.
Bars, that last line, my goodness. Toni Morrison wrote about a lot of thick love, thick and tough love. And I feel like the speaker's relationship with the father is that kind of love. So could you talk a little bit about father figures and the kind of role that the father plays in the text?
In some ways, when I think about it, I feel like my father's role in the text is minor compared to like all the matriarchs in the text. But it's actually, if I think about it, larger in a lot of ways, because a lot of these poems too, they're about his family. Not necessarily like only my mother's side. There's a lot of those like my mother and her mother poems, but pretty much everyone else is like the people who have passed away. It's all my dad's side. I think it's very complicated, right? Like thinking about the past. But it was around, we were like young, still children, but I mean, there was a lot of physical abuse. And then like, I don't know, I think maybe I was 10 or 11 and suddenly it just stopped. Wow. And at that age, you know, I'm not like, I'm trying to understand like why it stopped. I'm just like happy I'm not getting hit anymore, right?
Yeah, word.
And then, you know, then in junior high, I went through like my phase of like doing everything bad I could think of. And I just spent a lot of time grounded. And that's like, they took completely 180, like the whole thing just shifted. And later I came to find out that it actually had to do with like their involvement in church. And they were going to basically like couples therapy, but it was a group being run at the church. Learning about the fact that they were involved in church, and that was sort of like what created the shift in their parenting. I didn't really know, right, like the depth of it, but that day where the poem comes from is my parents were actually the guest speakers, and they were both at the altar. And so I didn't even know they were going to speak. It was just like, I'm 14 at the time. I was bored. I had like my Walkman and a book, and I was sitting in like a pew in the back. And I had no idea they were going to take the altar. And then I see my dad come up to the microphone. I'm like, what the heck? And that's when I'm like slowly like, okay, I'm taking one ear off. I'm starting to listen. And that is the testimony that he gives. Wow. So I had no idea that was happening. And he knew. And like no one warned me in the car. Like no one was like, and then I think maybe that, you know, paternal, like sort of lack of communication that happens sometimes, like, because then it would have required him to be vulnerable with me in the car, right? An exposed nail punctures my thigh when my father hits me with a piece of wood. At 11, I am forgiving. I can only force small words out of the tightness in my throat. Look what you did. That was the last time he hit me. Or at least this is what I believe. Is this the story I retell, the one in which I recall my father's shame? My father is intentional in the way he doesn't hit my youngest sister, the way Abuela taught him to. Abuela stood over him without restraint, switch in hand, her arm pulling back until everything was blurry. He is intentional now because the switch, the nearby tree, the piece of wood are all connected in memory. My father told me this, right? I can't find the moment in which he shared this truth. But I do just barely see a memory of Abuela, her shaking body menacing and swaying with violence. My father will learn how to love her even harder in her old age. He will be forgiving when he holds her small hand against his, imagines this was how she cradled his small body after birth.
So how that poem is from, gets to the moment of the father being disciplined by abuela, and then also starts with, of course, the speaker and the father. And that collapsing of time is so cool, and all of it happening at once. And throughout the text, it's this pressure cooked feeling. There's no section breaks. It's just, we're jumping in and we're staying in the deep end. And I'm so here for that kind of intensity, lyric intensity that happens. But the way that I feel as though that the text kind of gives reprieve is these reoccurring kind of, I love that you said, pieced together in memory, all these pieces kind of stitched throughout. And I'm especially thinking about the poem series, Call Me Refugee, and how that works through a motif, has a motif throughout the text. How there's all these different forms that are employed from pantoons, how there's sometimes blank space caesura, how sometimes they're persona poems, and it almost acts as though that's the section break of when this is, when those pop up. So I was wondering if, one, if you could read one of the poems from that sequence, and then also if you could talk about how you decided to almost scatter them or kind of sprinkle them throughout the text.
Call Me Refugee, 6. When we think of torture, the news tells us it's Afghans, the Taliban. But we know it is Los Estados. Now it's ISIS, they say. We've seen footage of hooded men, their hands and feet bound tightly behind them. El capucho es una oscuridad eterna, como la humedad de un cantón. These torture displays replay 1980, decades apart, halfway across the world. The only explanation, Los Estados, and the CIA agent who teaches military men torture, instructs others how to nearly drown someone, how to not, but just barely kill them.
El Salvador is more than a character in this text, it feels like. And it informs so much of the speaker's existence, so much of the speaker's father's existence, and of course abuela, which seems to be the main figures in the text.
An issue that I was having as actually like criticism of the manuscript was people would say, oh, but these poems that are about the war are just so jarring and they feel so disconnected from the family poems. And anyone who is from a war-torn country knows that war never leaves you. War is always with you. And Mai Dervang, in her book Yellow Rain, at the beginning, at the bottom says, I am a daughter, the second-born daughter of Hmong parents who fled, so I am also among the fled. And when I read that, I was just like, whoa, like she put into 2 sentences what I have struggled so hard to like convey to people, right? And that has been very hard for me. Like, how do I explain like why this war impacts me? And also like, who gets to question whether or not I get to write about the war, right? And so then I decided that I did always have this argument, right, that we should be considered refugees in the United States, considering that, you know, the Reagan administration fueled our war, right, and made it last 12 years because the guerrilla, right, the opposing side to the militarized government was winning when, like, the United States got involved. But yeah, I think it's just a way to show that not only should we be considered refugees in the United States because there's currently so many undocumented Salvadorians living in the United States, only some of them protected through TPS, but most of them are not protected with that work permit. And so the poems, I decided to title all the poems that were about the war one title. And so that's when I decided, well, these are all just going to be Call Me Refugee, because all of these are related to the war. All of these are reasons why we migrate, these migration stories, because there's the ones of like the shipping container, like the risks that people take to get here. And that's like actually my uncle who came in a shipping container with his wife, right? All of that is just like related to, I think, the trauma that we all carry when you're witnessing this, when you come from a war-torn country. It affects you in so many different ways, plus the extreme poverty that is a result of it, right? So we already know what poverty does to people, right? If we're looking around at the world.
But if there is light to be had from these ashes, from this hurt, besides the beautiful moments of like kind of matriarch power and the beauty in nature and the kind of the community that the speaker finds there, what else catharsis do you find here?
Through writing poetry, I always say I have like found a way to be like emotionally and mentally healthy, right? Because what else am I supposed to do with all of this that I carry, or all of this that we carry? And as a Salvadorian diaspora, we carry a lot. There's always a lot of emotions like at the readings, because they're just like, oh my God, that poem is like exactly like what I experienced, or this happened, or it reminded me of this that I had forgotten. And I think that even though it's really heavy, it's really hard to read even for me when I do readings. It is a process of healing, like getting through this, right? Getting through these poems. And for other Salvadorians, I mean, at least based that I've talked to about my poems, is just at least it gives them something to sort of think about, right? Think further about, like, or question like their own trauma, or question like their own experiences, and maybe put some connections together, right? John's Market on 8th and Mariposa. A journey through the desert brought you here. At 18, you were living in the middle of Los Angeles, a sea of people swarming past you, a young immigrant girl. You were determined to leave behind El Canton, your father drunk, yelling into the open kitchen, your polio, too. You wanted to forget, to not know the faces of the men who followed you home on those wet dirt roads. You wandered these streets, the same ones I roam now. I imagine you got lost. Buildings melted into one another and streets unfolded into mazes. You were homesick. Everything was different, yet somehow your neighbors were much like you. Migrants to the city who cried only in Spanish. On a day when all you could do was hold back tears, trying to translate labels in the aisles of a grocery store, you saw the shadow of a body you knew like the smell of El Rio Las Minas. My father's large mustache could not hide that he was the same boy who teased you during school recess. The same boy whom you watched walk past your childhood home thousands of times. I wonder if he'd ever crossed your mind after he left for Los Estados when you were 13. If you thought, at some point, we will meet again. You felt a rush of energy. You could smell the dirt of El Canton. This is how I imagine you saw him. You must have wanted to hug. My father was also like you in this strange place. This unbelievable thing was a wave crashing over you unexpectedly, and you emerged laughing, your jaw wide open with joy and disbelief at finding yourselves en el otro lado. Everything you understood about America now felt like a small canton, and those aisles became dirt roads, and you were children again, passing each other on the way. to somewhere. If anyone said you'd find him in another country, you would have thought them a fool. You said you didn't want a village boy, and yet the two of you were frozen in an alternate universe where the impossible was possible, because you found the only other person in this faraway planet who knew the wet color of home.
Gonna take a beat, but I really want to ask about the placement of that poem in the text. I think it's a really kind of cool inversion that happens, that placing near the end of the text, an origin story, right? And then also the speaker's birth comes at the end of the text as well, too. So, you know, of course, take a beat, because you just blessed the mic with that poem. Thank you so much. Like, straight bars, and your delivery was, woo, woo, you brought it. But yeah, why that kind of inversion?
I guess because in a lot of ways, I am a very selfless person, and I feel like, I write poetry for me in the way that I talked about earlier, like for my emotional health, for my mental health. But I'm writing also because telling these stories about my family or my mom and my grandparents and what happened to us, and for the Salvadoran diaspora, is so important to me that in some ways I decentered myself from the text, right? There's so many persona poems. There's so many poems that are just like witness poems as well. And so I decentered myself because that's what's central to the story to me. It's like the migration, the uncovering of history, like all the black holes, all the black holes of not having the knowledge of like what happened, or where do we come from, like how much has been erased, right? And not only do we have like the colonial erasure of when they burn like all the Mayan texts, but then we have the erasure of the war. So it was very customary during the war that they would burn down city halls and everything was kept in paper. So like thousands and thousands and thousands of records have been lost. So like to get back like more than 3 generations is pretty hard anywhere in El Salvador, due to the fact that like the burning of the city halls was happening as like a strategy against the government. So all of it is a process of sort of uncovering. So that's one reason why I decentered myself. And I think then those poems, I would say they're all the newer poems, really, the ones at the end of the book. And I started writing those later, I think, as I was actually, at the time, I was living in Westlake, which is, I was living on 8th and Alvarado, probably, less than a mile from where my parents like reunited at John's Market. And we call it Salvi Town. Everybody knows, everybody's Central American or Salvadorian right there. And I was always like walking around the community during the day. It felt like being in El Salvador, and at night, because it felt just as unsafe at night. But like during the day, you know, it was just so nice to be walking around and meeting with people. And all the time people would be like, oh, are you Salvadorian? And I'm like, or what are, like, you know, what are you? And then I'd be like, oh, I'm Salvadorian. And they're like, oh, well, were you born there? And then I would say no. And they're like, oh, well, then you're not really Salvadorian. And then it was in one of those instances that like I was so tired of having these encounters with people that I said, well, if all the blood inside my body came from El Salvador, then what does that make me?
That's good.
And then that's sort of when I started thinking about writing these poems of like that question that always happens, in the same way with the question of like, why were these war poems in there if I personally did not experience the war, right? And so then I decided to sort of put all these poems at the end of the book that address sort of why all of this is related to who I am. No matter the distance of we're no longer in El Salvador, the war is occurring, but we're here. I'm coming into this world in a tumultuous way. Like nothing is settled, nothing is serene. Like the day of my birth is complete chaos. Like, no one wants to listen to my mom because she's an immigrant, because she's speaking Spanish. Like, almost was literally born in a chair in the waiting room. Like, all of these things are occurring. And so I think that coming to that, like, it's like I entered this world sort of in the same way with that weight of what, like, the trauma of generations, like, has, right? And I think arriving there at the end to sort of understand, like, me, the author, and the speaker at that point, right, at the end of the book, when so many of the stories throughout are not, like, specifically me.
Right. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
No, it makes me think a lot about Rich's poem, Diving in the Wreck, right? That the speaker gets to the bottom and sees that the book of names doesn't have any of our names in there. And one of the awesome things about your text and why I enjoy it so much and speaking with you today is you made sure your people's names were in the book. Thank you for that. You learned me up. I appreciate it. Thank you for talking to me so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This was really great questions and a great conversation.